is Susan Glassman, and I, with Ruth Erzman, am co-president this year of Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice. And thank you so much for joining us for this evening's program, which is titled, What Would You Do with $250,000 Plus? The program will explore the gender pay gap and the consequences, and was specifically planned for this month, for March, because it's Women's History Month. So we thought it was timely, and we're very gratified that there's a great deal of interest, as evidenced by all the people who are now signing into this discussion. In addition to tonight's program, which I know you will enjoy, please also make plans to participate in our annual Visionary Voices program on Thursday, April 22nd. Reginald Dwayne Betts, the acclaimed poet and author, will discuss criminal justice reform, juvenile justice, and reentry. It had been our hope to present that program, which is a very special one, as a gala in a face-to-face evening, but sadly, the continuing struggle to bring COVID-19 under control has prevented that. So this program and other programs planned for the next several months will be presented virtually, as this one is. Please visit our website to sign up. There's two other programs that I want to mention that are in the very near future. One is the Racial Justice Book Club will discuss Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi, and that's on March 24th at 6:30. And the Racial Justice Movie Club on April 7th at 7, when there will be a shared viewing and discussion of I Am Not Your Negro. I urge you also to visit our website, and which is womensvoicesraised.org, as often as you can, to view updates of events and for the opportunity to get involved in critical advocacy activities. Our volunteers do work very, very hard to present concise information about current advocacy issues, things that are being discussed in the legislature and elsewhere, where the participation and the input of committed women would be very, very important. So please check often, because we do a very good job of updating that. Tonight's speakers, well, before I say that, I also want you to, when you're on our website and looking at events and advocacy opportunities, please become a member of Women's Voices. You'll find it very much worth your time and money to do that. So tonight's speakers will be introduced by Women's Voices board member and advocacy chair, Karen Francis. And during the presentation, please use the chat function on your device to write your questions. And at the end of the presentation, Karen will facilitate a Q&A with our speakers. Thank you very much and enjoy the program.
Well, welcome everyone to this exciting evening. I know we're competing with the president, but he didn't ask us if there was a conflict, but I am very excited to have you join us about this very important issue about the gender pay gap. And when we talk about this, it's not just a woman's issue, this is a family issue. Our two speakers are going to be Robin Lucas, who is with the American Association of University Women, and she is our Grassroots Advocacy Director. And our other speaker is going to be Dr. Ana Kent, and you usually don't use your doctor before your name, but Ana, it's very important to recognize that. If our First Lady can use it, you should use it. And Ana is with the Federal Reserve Bank here in St. Louis, and she's going to be addressing a term that I have now started to use, the issue of the wealth gap. So we're going to hear a lot about why this issue is so important, how it affects us throughout our entire lifespan and our families. And with that, Robin, you're on. And thank you everyone for joining us. And like Susan said, if you have any questions, please put your questions in the chat and we will have, I hope, a very healthy discussion after the presentation. So thank you and welcome. And I think everyone should be muted.
Thank you, Karen. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to give it a minute until the slides pop up and we can go to the second slide on the deck. Thank you, Nancy.
This is the right one, Robin?
No, the other one. That'll be the second deck.
Okie doke.
The PDF.
For some reason, that's not showing on my desktop, so give me a second.
Okay. I'll introduce myself and my organization briefly while we pull that up. Hello, everyone. My name is Robin Lucas. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And as Karen said, I'm the Grassroots Advocacy Manager at the American Association of University Women. AAUW is a national nonprofit working to advance gender equity through advocacy, education, and research. We fight to remove barriers and biases that stand in the way of gender equity and have been since 1881. Among our most critical focus areas, we do continually fight for gender equity in the workplace, including equal pay, which is what we'll talk about tonight. I do want to give first an overview of the equal pay issue overall, how it impacts each of us, and then later in the evening, I'll offer some direct ways that you as engaged citizens can contribute your valuable advocacy efforts. I do want to operate tonight with two key messages in mind. The first being the gender pay gap is a danger to all workers in the United States, not just women and not just families, though it does impact us the most. And then two, there is no one bill fits all kind of approach to protecting equal pay and opportunities for women. So we need to prioritize addressing discrimination overall, as well as specific loopholes that exist in the law. So as we go into the webinar tonight, I challenge you to think about what your professional experiences have been and think about how the facts that we're about to share with you would impact each step of your career. Doing the work to constructively and intentionally understand your experiences as an individual will benefit you as you fight for social justice and change. And understanding yourself in the greater context of equal pay will help you tailor your possible advocacy messaging for your specific area and communities. Now, I understand there are different viewing experiences tonight between YouTube and Zoom and laptops or tablets. So I'll give a general review and read through slides so you don't have to worry about like peering at your screen. But this slide is, what is the gender pay gap? The gender pay gap is the difference between men and women's median earnings working full-time for the entire year. The gender pay gap exists for women of all backgrounds, at all ages, all levels of education, and in nearly every profession. Like, that is really critical to understand, that this is not one area, one group that experiences it, but it is prevalent throughout our society. The gender pay gap is a result of a long history of discrimination against women in the workforce, but we want to focus on the United States and the evolution of our rights as citizens and workers. So it comes with both old and new practices. Overall, women working full-time in the United States make 82 cents per dollar of what all men make. 82 cents. We are not equal, despite all of our attempts to protect our equality. It's been an uphill battle, and today in 2021, we still come up against some of the same arguments that women fought against 60 plus years ago, from we menstruate, we get pregnant, to accessing the education or training required for fields that are relentlessly dominated by men. There continue to be these arguments supporting a devaluing of women's compensation for doing the same work as men. And then finally, the gender pay gap tends to be larger for women of color, and in some cases actually appears to be widening, not shifting down. The gender pay gap is the result of many factors, including race and ethnicity, disability, access to education, and age. As a result, different groups of women experience very different gaps in pay. It continues under the guise of gender-based myths, like I just talked about, and discriminatory practices taking advantage of these loopholes in our legal systems. But I want to take a step back for a second and review more the history and evolution of women's rights in the workforce, just to help frame the conversation tonight. Next slide, please. Excellent. So our right to work has a very long and tumultuous history. Protecting that right, one that many fought long and hard for, continues today as an ongoing effort to manipulate these loopholes, means a continuation of this gender pay gap. I want to highlight 6 laws that contribute to and protect our rights as working women. The first, not being labor related, most white women in the United States did not work outside of the home at the beginning of the 20th century, and indeed did not even have a say in their treatment or opportunities to work until winning the right to vote for the elected officials making these decisions. So I have the 19th Amendment listed there first. Second, in 1938, FDR signed the Fair Labor Standards Act, creating the first federal minimum wage and establishing the formal 40-hour work week. While this law did not address women in the workforce in particular, it has proven to be a critical piece of legislation for our labor rights. The third one, it took another 25 years after that for the Equal Pay Act to pass in 1963, making it illegal to pay a woman less based solely on her sex and providing some legal tools and pathways for her to challenge pay discrimination. This was and is a foundational law for women's rights in the workforce. However, it was not meant to be an end-all be-all for workplace discrimination, but just the start. Also, this is a piece of legislation that AAUW had a direct hand in getting passed, so very proud of that. Fourth piece of legislation, the most important law protecting women against discrimination at work was actually an accident. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal for an employer with 15 or more employees to discriminate on the basis of sex, as well as race, religion, or national origin. Prior to this law, an employer could outright refuse to even hire a woman. This bill made hostile work environments based on sex or sexual harassment illegal. And a more recent interpretation of Title VII of the law also has made discrimination based on gender stereotyping illegal. And I say this was an accident because when the bill for racial equality that we all know this bill, the Civil Rights Act to be, was being debated in Congress, those who were against the legislation thought that adding sex to the list would actually gather enough opposition to tank the bill. However, we all know, joke's on them, it's now law. The fifth piece of legislation, in 1974, decisions in 2 cases by the Supreme Court held that insurance policies excluding coverage for pregnant employees did not violate Title VII. Congress did not agree with these 2 rulings, and 4 years later passed the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, making discrimination based on pregnancy or pregnancy-related conditions illegal. AAUW is currently working to update this and close loopholes by passing the Bipartisan Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, but I'll get to that a little bit later. And then finally, the Family Medical Leave Act of 1993 built the framework for working parents, outlining that a parent working for a company with 50 or more employees can, in many instances, take up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave to care for a newborn child or newly adopted child. That's a lot of information. I feel like I was just Schoolhouse Rock for a minute, explaining how a bill is passed, but it's all really important to understand our history and how we got to where we are today. It's also worth noting that much of this seminal legislation is due for an update. You can see how long ago many of these were passed. Now that we know more about how discrimination works, there are, and the number of holes that have been poked and manipulated in these laws over the years, it really is important to update all of this legislation. Next slide, please. All right, so those laws sound like they should have our rights and protections covered, right? Not so true. Unfortunately, the gender pay gap and workplace equality are still far off in the United States. The gender pay gap has barely budged in the past 20 years, and this is perpetuated in 3 core ways that I've highlighted here: occupational segregation, the motherhood penalty, also the fatherhood bonus, and then direct gender and racial discrimination. So Occupational segregation is leading to jobs dominated by men or women being amongst the highest or lowest paid. As you can see in the infographic here, 15 of the 20 highest paying jobs are dominated by men, and 14 of the 20 lowest paying jobs are dominated by women. That is occupational segregation and how it perpetuates the gender pay gap. 2, motherhood penalty. Studies have documented that employers are less likely to hire mothers, including mothers who have never left the workforce, than they are to hire women without children. And when employers do make an offer to a mother, they offer her a lower salary than they offer other women. Now, a related note on this, the fatherhood bonus contributes to the gender pay gap when men receive a pay bump for being perceived as the family's breadwinner. And then finally, direct discrimination. America's history of slavery, segregation, and exploitation of immigrants has created deep-rooted inequalities that persist today. Consequently, most women of color have not had, nor do they have now, access to the same education and employment opportunities that white people have. The wage gap for many women of color is not only wider than the overall gender wage gap, but it is also closing much more slowly. Next slide, please. So how does the gender pay gap impact us? We all know it impacts us in many different ways. I believe over these past few slides, many of you have probably recognized some of the myths or reasoning behind a lower pay. It can really hit home. I am going to drop a link in the chat once I'm finished with this slide, so you can learn more from the report that AAUW maintains called The Simple Truth About the Gender Pay Gap. But here I've pulled some poignant facts to frame our conversation. First of all, research shows that a 20-year-old woman starting full-time year-round work today stands to lose over $400,000 over a 40-year career compared to her male counterpart. Collectively, working women in the United States lose out on more than $500 billion a year. Within that, I've got 3 points here. The first one is so the gender wage gap increases over the course of a woman's work life and follows her into retirement. If you're paid less than men, then your retirement and Social Security benefits will be smaller. Second one being it's widest for women ages 55 to 64. So women 55 to 64 years old are paid 78% as much as men in the same age range, and a gap that is more than doubled for the gap for women ages 20 to 24. And third, women are more likely to be employed by lower paying jobs. In fact, they actually make up 2/3 of the nation's lowest wage workforce. And those 3 facts right there impact a majority of us and our families, and very clearly can show how this impacts the people in our lives and our country. At that, I'm going to pause and shift over to Anna, but I do want to let you know I'm dropping a link in the chat for everyone to look at.
Thanks, Robin. I'll go ahead and share my screen. While I'm doing that, yeah, Robin, that was really great and informative and really useful to have that background. So hopefully someone yell at me if you can't see my screen that I'm sharing right now. But as I was introduced, thank you to Women's Voices Raised for this invitation. I'm really excited to have this conversation. As my disclaimer, as a Fed employee, these are my own views and not necessarily those of the Fed, the Federal Reserve Board, or the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, or the system generally. But yeah, so mine is going to be a little bit more focused on the data. Robin already gave us a really good overview of the gender wage gap. There's another GWG, which is the gender wealth gap, which I'll be hitting a little bit harder here, as well as talking about how COVID has impacted women in particular. So before that, I'm going to step back and talk about where women were right before early 2020. So women, first of all, just stepping back, the end of 2019 was the end of a record-long 10-year economic expansion, which is a big deal because since it was such a long expansion, a lot of people, a lot of groups who historically were on the sidelines were able to be pulled into the economy, into the labor force, into higher paying jobs as employers began to need to be more competitive in their job offers and their compensation. So that was good news for a lot of different groups, but as well as women. So women made up half of the civilian non-farm workforce. You may have heard something like that in the past at the end of 2019, early 2020, which is a big deal. We were also earning advanced degrees and starting businesses at higher rates than men, even though, as you'll see later on, women are less likely to own a business. We were still starting them at this time at higher rates. And then I think this last point here is pretty interesting as well. So in marriages that were dual income or both, in this case, a heterosexual couple, male, female, were both employed and had incomes, about 29% of women in those marriages were breadwinners. In other words, the primary breadwinners, their incomes were higher than their husbands, which is also a big deal. That number has been at roughly historical highs. So women were really contributing in force to the economy in 2019. So that's kind of the high point. And the data that I'm going to be showing you here about the wealth gap also comes from 2019. So just have that frame of mind when you're thinking about high points versus low points. We're kind of talking about the high point for women here. And then, of course, COVID will come into the picture and we'll see something a little bit different. So the gender wealth gap, this is fairly recent work that myself and a colleague, Lowell Ricketts, have done, where we basically looked at the best data set that we have on wealth, the survey of consumer finances, and said, okay, regardless of age, regardless of generation, of race or ethnicity, of marital status, of many different other demographics, what is the overall gender wealth gap? And we found that overall in 2019, it was $55 per $100 of male wealth. So again, this is a little bit confusing because sometimes the way that this is measured is by looking only at single families, single people, because it's easier to talk about wealth, especially because wealth is measured at the family level. The gender wealth gap, it's easier to talk about with singles because you're not confounding male and females in the same household. But we did some fancy analytics to kind of get around that and basically found out that if you just lump everybody together, that's what it is. So basically women overall have roughly half as much wealth as men do, as men-led families. So this is, again, just like Robin was talking about the median wage gap, the family right in the middle at the 50th percentile. Here we're talking about the median wealth gap right in the middle, 50th percentile. But these kinds of disparities remain regardless of where you're looking on the percentile gender wealth spectrum. So you can see that at the top, about 7% of women-headed families are millionaires, have at least $1 million in wealth or more, compared to 17% of male-headed families. On the other end, the bottom end of the spectrum, we have 14% of women-headed families that have no wealth, so zero wealth or are in debt, in fact. And this is when you tabulate all of their assets and subtract all of their debts. And that's compared to 8% of male-headed households. So we see these disparities at the top, we see them at the middle, and we see them at the bottom. And another way of looking at this is looking at specific types of assets. So people talk about, especially for the middle class, how important home ownership is. And that's what this top number is here. So for women-headed households, about 62% of them own a house. Men's value is higher than that, 68%. One that I'm really intrigued about here, and I think is really consequential, is the second one. 46% of women have retirement savings. And as Robin was saying, if you have a gender wage gap, that's going to impact women in retirement as well because of Social Security, lower retirement savings, et cetera. And as we all know, women tend to, on average, live longer than men. And so this is really incredibly consequential for women, for widows, for people heading into retirement. Men's value of holding retirement shares and their actual numbers are also larger than women. And then while 8% of women own a business, that's about 15% for men. So regardless of which avenue you look, and there are many others that you can look at, student loan debt, you can look at the liability side as well. Whatever you look at in terms of wealth, anything, any part of the balance sheet, pretty much, you're seeing these types of disparities between women and men. Okay, so this slide, don't worry, I'm not going to walk you through it all. I just wanted to put it up here and make it available to you in case you were curious or wanted to look more deeply later. Basically, this takes marital status and race and ethnicity into account. So if you're curious, well, what about single Black men versus women? You can go back to this chart and refer to it and see what that looks like. Again, I'm not going to bore you and look at every single aspect here, but I want to call your attention to the table on the right side. So that table just compares white, Black, and Hispanic women to the same race ethnicity males, and as well as white males. So white non-Hispanic women had about 56% of the wealth of white men. Black non-Hispanic women had about 27% as much wealth as Black men. So that's, first of all, a bigger gap for Black women, as well as for Hispanic women, where the gap was about 46%. And Black and Hispanic women had about 5 cents and 10 cents per dollar of white male wealth. So that is just a massive, I mean, you talk about the gender wage gap, which is incredibly important and contributes to the gender wealth gap. But I mean, basically any demographic that you're looking at, the gender wealth gap is going to be larger because it compounds over time and wealth begets wealth. And it's no different for the gender wealth gap. So I think that this is just incredibly frustrating, it's sickening, and it's good to know, as Robin was saying, for your own purposes as you go out and talk to other people about this, because a lot of people just don't know the magnitude of these gaps. Okay, so I'm gonna be on this page just briefly because I think Robin did a pretty good job and she's more well-versed than I am in this area, but I just wanted to talk about some myths that people frequently discuss when you talk about the gender wage gap or the gender wealth gap. Sometimes people will say, oh, well, if you just, match people based on their education or match people based on their industry, their career, their level of experience, their years of experience, then that kind of just all goes away, right? And the short answer is no, it does not. It certainly is, the gap shrinks. Certainly we do find that, but we have to also, first of all, it still remains. And second of all, we have to ask ourselves, why does that even matter in the first place? Like, why are we even looking to control for those things in the first place? Because there is in our country, in our society, these gender norms and gender expectations that push women perhaps into different career choices or force them to make certain choices about, okay, am I going to be the primary breadwinner in my family, or am I going to step back and take care of my kids or my relatives? And disproportionately, that unpaid, less valued work falls to women. Okay, so stepping back and just going through these quickly. First of all, career choice. Robin hit on this already in her last slide there, but I was actually in a presentation about something similar this week. And the presenter was saying that women-dominated careers are less valued than those dominated by men. And that's something that we know, that's something that Robin said. But she interestingly gave the example of computer technology. When it was first emerging, it was actually a career dominated by women, and it was lower paying. And then as men began to outnumber women in this industry, in this career path, then all of a sudden it became a lucrative, higher paying career choice. And so to me, I think that's really indicative of how we value stereotypically female or male careers differently. It's not necessarily about the value of the work for society, but maybe the value that we place on it based on our gender norms. So that's one. Two, salary negotiation. We hear this sometimes that, oh, if women just argued more for themselves, either in the beginning or were able to bring up raises or promotions more, then that would open up the conversation and women would have higher wages, higher incomes. Well, actually, no. The research says that this can backfire on women. So if women take on stereotypically male characteristics, that can backfire. They can be seen as cold. They can be seen as assertive or even bitchy, not in a not in a good way. Whereas if those same characteristics and those same strategies are employed by a man, then that they're seen as authoritative, as leadership material. And so, yeah, this can definitely backfire on a woman. 3, Robin also talked about the motherhood penalty and the fatherhood penalties, or fatherhood bonus rather. So yeah, I won't really touch on that one, just to say that mothers tend to have lower salaries than childless women, and there's a null effect or the opposite even for fathers. 4th, shorter hours and years of experience. And this one, along with career choice, does actually account for much of the gap if you control it, for the wage gap. But again, it doesn't get rid of the gap, not by any means. And we have to think about why those things are even, why there are those disparities in the first place. So again, women may feel more pressured by society, by societal norms to take that time off. And I think a lot of that, again, goes to how we're not necessarily in the United States very friendly towards women who try to have both a career and be a family person, towards women or towards men, frankly, right? Because a lot of times paternal leave isn't a thing that is reflected in the same way as it is for a woman. So again, controlling for that and other factors, the wage gap remains. I should also mention that controlling for things like age, education, home ownership, income, part-time versus full-time, inheritance, race, ethnicity, marital status, a couple of others, the gender wealth gap also remains significant. And the 5th one here is just less representation at the executive level. As Robin mentioned, the gender wage gap tends to grow with age, also tends to grow at higher executive level, C-suite level type positions. The pay gap is actually higher at these types of high level paying roles. So it's not like, oh, let's just get women to more leadership positions. Well, okay, that's great. I'm all for that, but let's make sure that they're compensated appropriately then as well. All right, so moving on to COVID. So that was all pre-COVID. That was 2019. Again, the height of an economic expansion. Things were going well. And then, of course, the coronavirus crisis hit, as well as the recession. And what makes this one different is what you've probably heard called the she session. Whereas in past recessions, males tend to have higher unemployment rates just due to the nature of male-dominated industries being more affected. The opposite has been true during this recession. It's also been true that groups that have historically had lower wages and lower wealth have been disproportionately affected negatively, economically speaking, during this coronavirus recession, in part because they're overrepresented in hard-hit industries like leisure and hospitality. 23% of Black women and 29% of Hispanic women were in leisure and hospitality industries and similar industries. So that's huge numbers. And that really speaks to something that I haven't touched on too much here, but that there's intersections. So it's not just women as a whole, but especially when you start looking at intersections of race and ethnicity or of education with these things, we see even more disparate outcomes. Many women lack benefits like paid sick time, or even being able to take that sick time. And so they had to make really difficult choices, especially near the beginning of the pandemic. If they're sick, should they go in? Do they get that option to stay home? Do they have to take time off, unpaid time off to take care of family members, et cetera? And care responsibility, you all know this, I'm preaching to the choir here, but women disproportionately make up the population that takes care of their kids or takes care of elderly relatives or other relatives as well. And while it was really interesting back in, I think this paper came out in March or April. It was very early on in 2020 that it came out. But it was by male economists, and they were saying basically that they were hopeful that the work from home situation would help with gender equity because more males and females were staying home. And so the idea was that they would see what females have to do anyway on a day-to-day basis. And the splitting of work-home responsibilities would be more equitable. Well, I can tell you now, a year later, that is not backed by the data. That has not happened. Women are still disproportionately taking care of home life, even if they're working full-time, regardless of whether that's in the house or outside of the house. And given what you know now about the gender wage gap and the gender wealth gap, it probably doesn't surprise you that women compared to men lack stability. So they were feeling less able to handle, for example, an emergency expense. And especially if they lost their jobs, had low wealth to fall back on, that put them in a very precarious position. We know that, childcare centers, daycare centers, many of them are closed for a while. School continues to be virtual for many students. And that puts women in a very difficult position where they need to choose, particularly mothers of young kids, between remaining in the labor force and pulling out in order to take care of their other home responsibilities. So this has been an issue. The She session has been discussed quite a bit in the media. And one of the things that has come out of that is the New York Times created a primal scream line, basically a hotline where they encouraged mothers to call in and just vent. And you can Google that and see some of the quotes, but these are some that I wanted to pull out. So one mother says, "I wish I had the energy to scream. All of my energy just goes into getting through every day until I can go to sleep. I have 3 kids, all in virtual school since March and work full time. And it just feels like failing every day at everything I do. And I just want to change, want to be myself for 1 minute. I don't know how to keep doing this, but there isn't really another option." Another mother says, "I'm going to lose my mind if something doesn't happen soon." And a third quote here, "God, every day I think I can't do this again, but then I do. I get it. I get up and I do it." Because that's just what parents do, right? So, I think these illustrate that a lot of these issues that we're talking about today were ongoing. They're not new, like women have been juggling career and family for decades, disproportionately compared to men. But of course, the pandemic has exacerbated the extent to which we're really focusing on that, I think in a positive light, hopefully, to make changes where we can really support women going into the future. But also it's been more difficult, right? Especially, as I said, for those women who, there's a couple of different things. There's women who are fortunate enough to have kept their jobs and are working from home, but maybe are struggling with having a toddler in the background crying while they're trying to be on a Zoom call. Or you have women who are also kept their job, but had to go in. So they had to balance their health and the health of their family with having a salary and having being able to put food on the table. And then you have the women who lost their jobs, again, with less of a cushion than a male-headed household would have at the median. So here we have, I think, some very clear examples of the difficulties that have been faced. So my last slide, I just wanted to compare, because we've been in this for a year now, the employment situation in February from this year compared to last year. So if you look at the numbers in the box on the left, I'll talk about the unemployment rate first. So the unemployment rate for women and men, usually they track each other fairly closely. Again, during recessions past, men's unemployment rate usually spikes more than women's. And then eventually they go down to roughly they're interchanging, fluctuating around the same level. Here in February 2021, a month ago, women's unemployment rate was about 6% compared to men's at about 7%. So again, similar. Women's peaked more in April of 2020, and eventually they went down to a similar rate. Now you might say, okay, like this is still higher than it was back in February, which was around a little over 3%. And that's certainly true. but women's is no longer higher than men. So isn't this a good thing? It's a little bit misleading because the unemployment rate is based on how many people are in the labor force. So if there are fewer people in the labor force, in other words, women have become disillusioned and are no longer actively looking for a job, then they're not going to be counted in this unemployment rate. And that's what we've seen. That's what this top number is. Over 2 million women in the past year have dropped from the labor force. So they've said, I'm pulling out for whatever reason. We know that for mothers, especially mothers of young children, one of the top reasons that they give is because of childcare pressure. So we know that this has a direct effect on women's labor force participation, women's engagement with the employment system. And by the way, women's labor force participation has been increasing over the past couple of decades, but it tends to be lower than other developed countries, like say in Europe, where they have more support for things like childcare and supporting women in these ways. And then the third number here is we have about 2 million more women who are unemployed. So here we're counting women who stayed in the labor force and have said in the past month or so that they've been actively looking for a job, but they're unemployed. So we have both the fact that women have been dropping out, pulling out, becoming disillusioned, saying maybe I'll try again later from the labor force, as well as more women staying in the labor force but unemployed. So here are just some things that we can think about. And I know Robin will, I'm sure, add many other great options because there are just a slew of things that we can do. So first of all, invest in care infrastructure. So one of the ways that government thinks about pulling people out of a recession is by investing in infrastructure, in large part because oftentimes during recessions, construction jobs and those types of production jobs are more affected. So yeah, investing in infrastructure seems to make sense. But as Heather McCullough, President and CEO of Closing the Women's Wealth Gap, likes to say, let's invest. It's time to invest in care infrastructure. And I think that's really important and will disproportionately help women as well. Enhancing women and family-friendly work policies and benefits, arguing for that paid family leave or paid sick leave that, you know, again, other countries are better at doing than we are and have higher women labor force participation rates. Looking beyond the average American, average being in quotes, because if you've heard of the term K-shaped recovery, you know that economists now have seen that people that were doing well before the pandemic tend to be doing well or even better, whereas people that were not doing so well tend to be doing worse. And when you look at average statistics as opposed to median statistics, like Robin and I have been talking about, you're actually capturing a well-to-do American just because of the way that wealth is distributed unevenly in our country. So just that's the statistician in me wanting to throw that out. And just be aware if you hear the word average, that is probably not representative of the typical American. And then one final thing, just encourage better data sharing. So we need better data in myriad of ways in lots of places. In terms of different demographics and smaller demographic groups, but also better data sharing. So not making it taboo to talk about your wage and ask your coworkers, because otherwise, how are you going to know if there's a gender wage gap in your company? You know, unless we talk about these things. So that's, I think, the first step in remediating the situation. So with that, I will turn it back over to Robin, who will give us some additional great information.
All right, let's get that slide deck back up. Hold on. It's a lot of information. We're really looking forward to answering questions and talking with y'all too. All right. Hold on. So there's a lot of information and being engaged citizens that we all are here. We didn't want to leave you without somewhere to direct your efforts. Next slide, please. Okay, so There are a few key bills that I want to direct your attention to, and generally protecting women in the workplace. As this slide says, we need you. We need your involvement. So I've highlighted 3 pieces of legislation that AAUW is working directly to get passed right now. And while I saw a few of the questions that have been dropped in the chat already, a lot of these pieces of legislation directly address some of these persistent inequalities and inequities that enforce the gender pay gap. First one here, the Paycheck Fairness Act. Paycheck Fairness Act was first introduced 24 years ago, and it would provide new tools to fight discriminatory pay practices and effect incentives and assistance to help employers comply with the law. So it's aimed at those loopholes that I mentioned in the Equal Pay Act of 1963. It would improve research on the gender pay gap, which can help identify, correct, and eliminate illegal wage disparities. The Paycheck Fairness Act would allow workers to discuss or inquire about their wages free from retaliation, just like Anna was just talking about, with common sense exceptions. And the bill would also encourage businesses to rely on information about the market value of a position, some industry standards, job duties, and budgets in order to determine salaries by prohibiting reliance on salary history. Now, it's a really important facet that we're going after that we can talk more about in the question portion. AUW has a toolkit on the Paycheck Fairness Act to guide you in contacting your elected officials, writing a letter to the editor to engage your local community, and building support on social media. The second bill is the Raise the Wage Act. The Raise the Wage Act would raise the minimum wage for the first time in over a decade. Women make up nearly 2/3 of minimum wage workers nationwide, and women of color in particular are overrepresented amongst essential workers on the pandemic front lines. The minimum wage must be raised to support women workers. Third is the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. In turn, strengthens the labor protections on workplace treatment of pregnant employees, ensuring fair treatment as basic as allowing a pregnant employee to carry water with them or take bathroom breaks. Many people who are pregnant still risk being forced out of the workplace simply for following their doctor's orders. AUW's call to action is to contact your members of Congress for all 3 of these bills, and I can include links on how to connect with us on that front. With all 3 of these, my final tip to be a really above and beyond advocate is to share your experience with advocacy online and with your family and friends. Social media and conversations like ours tonight are great tools for both accountability with your fellow community members and also with elected officials, and it really serves as an important tool to educate your communities. And then next slide. So our final slide here. Speaking of social media, please engage with us on Equal Pay Day. So Equal Pay Day denotes how far into the new year women must work to be paid what men were already paid in the previous year. This was started by the National Committee on Pay Equity in 1996, and the goal was to raise awareness about the gender pay gap. Since then, other equal pay days have been added to the calendar each year to denote that mothers and most women of color face a wider than average gap, and we need to work, and they need to work even longer to catch up on men's earnings. So I've got the calendar listed out here. Asian American and Pacific Islander women's equal pay day was this week, March 9th. What is time? So Asian American and Pacific Islander women are paid 85 cents for every dollar paid to white men. All women's equal pay day is March 24th, so that's coming up. This is all women working full-time year-round are paid 82 cents for every dollar paid to all men who work full-time year-round. Mother's Equal Pay Day is June 4th and compares the 70 cents mothers make to every dollar paid to fathers. Black Women's Equal Pay Day is August 3rd, representing the 63 cents for Black women are paid to every dollar paid to non-Hispanic white men. And Native American Women's Equal Pay Day is September 8th for the 60 cents for every dollar paid to non-Hispanic white men. And then Latina's Equal Pay Day is October 21st for the 55 cents for every dollar paid to non-Hispanic white men. So as Ana was really great to point out with a bunch of her statistics, we are very particular about the wording that is used to represent each of these statistics. Like all women's equal pay day is all women and all men. But when we do break it down based off of race or parenthood, it can compare to the women of that race or ethnicity versus non-Hispanic white men. So I appreciated the difference in the statistics that Ana shared on the wealth gap as well. That is it so we can close out the shared screen now. We can move to questions and whatnot, but I did want to share that, and I look forward to engaging with everyone on either legislation or equal pay days.
Wow, the information.
Deep breath.
So I don't know, first off, Robin and Ana, thank you. Such numbers do speak. They really do. And I happened to catch CBS News the other day, a survey that was done by LinkedIn, and I think both of you hit at some of this, but it was just staggering that they said 70% of women feel they need to lessen their career expectations because of COVID. 39% feel that they are failing their children. 60% they feel that they are underperforming because of COVID. I mean, so with your expertise, what can we share with our colleagues, our daughters who are living this right now? Either one of you can take that question.
Oh, it's an emotional question.
When I saw that on CB, I was very emotional, and you can tell that just, oh my God, we've gone backwards. We've gone backwards.
When you were sharing those statistics, and especially how you worded the question, it reminded me of a very broad statistic or anecdotal statistic that was shared to me when I first joined the workforce after college, that in general, men applying to a job look at a job description, and if they fulfill maybe 30-40% of the job description, they'll apply for it. They think that they belong in that job. But with women, we look at a job description, and if we don't fill at least 60-75% of that description in our experience already, we won't apply for it. And I think that this is just a new iteration of the same reality that women looking to be in the workforce in this country experience, is just the crippling imposter syndrome that a lot of us experience, and the just devaluing of our time. So just sharing these realities and what you've learned tonight with people is really important, so they know what is real. The gender wage gap and the gender wealth gap are real. This is not a myth. This is math. This is reality. But there are ways around it, and advocacy is a big part of that. I mean, you've got to get involved. And what I can tell people, on top of advocacy with the government and improving regulations and protections, interacting with your employer directly. Like, it has to start somewhere. And if you are working somewhere, making sure that your workplace is healthy and protecting women and pay equity and equality, then you've made a really important start.
Thank you, Robin. Ana, you want to join in with that, or I can go to the next question that's in the chat?
Yeah, no, there's so many good questions in the chat. I'll just add that I think I really liked how Robin gave us a bit of the history of this and how it's developed. And as many of you have probably seen or experienced in your own career, like we should celebrate the fact that we have come a long way, in a compared to history, a relatively short time. That being said, as I was saying in my presentation, like this pandemic has lifted up a lot of the issues that were already there before, but were maybe just being ignored. We're just kind of the status quo. It was kind of like, okay, like we'll keep marching towards something better, but we're going to kind of take it step by step. And I think now, because the Band-Aid has been ripped off, people are looking at this much more closely, and it really gives opportunity, right? Like crisis presents opportunity. So it's up to us to take that, move forward, and really start to make jumps and leaps and bounds, as opposed to these tiny steps that we've I think in a year or two ago were complacent with, quite frankly. And I think just the fact that we're having this conversation and more people are becoming aware of it, as I said, these types of articles have come out a lot in the media and popular press. So I think more people know. And even though those male economists that wrote that study back in March or April were off the bat on a lot of things, I think that they were right in the sense that males who have been working at home maybe have seen a little bit more closely the struggles, even if they haven't stepped up and equalized their help. They've seen the struggles that women are facing, and a lot of employers have seen the struggles that disproportionately women face. And so I think that we just need to capitalize on that. We need to move forward. And again, not advocating for any policy as a member of the Fed, but just talking about like the need to, as Robin was saying, the data are real. We need to talk about it more and move towards action.
Well, thank you. I'm looking at the chat. So I think, Robin, you may have touched on this, but one of our questions is, how is research being used to influence policy decisions at the federal level and the state level, either one of you?
Absolutely, it is. Any research that is verified and from a reputable source is cited when pushing for a lot of these improvements. At AAUW, I work in the national office in Washington, D.C., but we have affiliates in every state and U.S. territory. So there are 56 subgroups throughout the entire United States area. And with them, we try and both use national statistics, but also drill down on that specific state or territory. And it can be really difficult. I mean, I'll say research is used when and where it's possible, but a lot of this research is lacking. And that is one of the big pushes with the Paycheck Fairness Act, is that the United States government, like the federal government, year to year, administration to administration, it fluctuates what information is gathered. And we're also seeing the severe lack of information that is gathered. A lot of the statistics that we rely on are from private organizations or nonprofits. They're not from the federal government and from the Department of Labor. And that is a struggle of ours. Within all of the equal pay days, we've finally been able to include like Native Americans equal pay day for Native American women. But our Equal Pay Day Coalition has been trying to talk about representing the LGBTQIA communities. And we can't do that because there's absolutely no data for equal pay when it intersects with the LGBTQIA communities. It just isn't recorded. So it's a yes and no, but like honestly, the research is a big push for policy. We need it, but it is very important to utilize.
Well, thank you. Our next question: closing the wage and wealth gap will require many types of action. What impact might more be robust union membership make for women who work in the service fields?
Well, I'll give my brief answer, and then maybe Robin will like to chime in. So I have not personally done research on unionization. I will say that what I have read in other areas suggests that it's helpful, in obviously collective bargaining and getting higher wages and benefits. I almost don't even want to talk about this one, but I in preparation for this, event meeting, I was doing research, and one of the suggestions was that in recent times, that's kind of unionization in terms of the gender wage gap has kind of fallen away as an explanatory factor compared to what it was maybe a couple of decades ago. So I leave that to you. Again, I'm not an expert in this. I think that some research suggests that it can be helpful. No research suggests that it's harmful, certainly. And maybe it's just not quite as powerful a factor today as it was in the past. But I think part of that might also have to do with the fact that unionization rates for both men and women are falling, generally speaking.
Well, thank you.
I do know that like those rates are falling, and while women have been a very important part of labor organizing from the beginning, I know that women being welcomed in unions is more of a recent history. You know, it's only been in the past few decades as opposed to from the beginning. So reaping the benefits of that takes time. And also the one fact I am aware of is that while women I know do make up a lot of union memberships, I think it's close to half. I think like it's quite high these days. The representation in union leadership is incredibly lacking. So this right here, I think that unions actually participate in the gender pay gap as opposed to being a solution to. But that is trending differently. While you know union memberships might be falling, like that rate might be falling, the number of different fields that are unionizing is definitely expanding. I mean, we see it in the case with some big companies, as well as some
like Amazon.
Yeah, exactly. Or even fields, like a lot of nonprofit spaces are starting to unionize. So there are definitely benefits there. I think that the concept of unions is going to evolve a little bit.
Well, thank you. Our next question, given the difficulties women are experiencing, especially right now in the pandemic, are there any recent findings regarding the birth rate or changes in the intention of having children in the future?
Have you?
Yeah, either way, I'm happy to start with that one. Again, not my personal research, but you know, I do read extensively in this area. And what I've been reading has suggested that, yeah, first of all, there are a lot of ongoing studies, ongoing research to look at exactly this question. And overwhelmingly, the answer is yes, it has been impacting the birth rate. The latest figure I saw for the US was about 7% lower or so. In other places like Italy, for example, they're in the double digits in terms of impact. I think Japan as well. So yeah, it's definitely impacting birth rates, not just in the US, but as well as around the world. In terms of intention to bear future children, I've also seen that as a factor. Whereas in the 50s and 60s, women were having more children than they wanted. In more recent years, that has been reversed, where women are having fewer children than they wanted. And the pandemic is expected to exacerbate that.
And what a great segue into the next question. How does a woman's right to manage her reproductive life impact this situation? And Nancy, this was your question. The turnaway study inform our understanding of that intersectionality. I'm not familiar with that. So Nancy, you may want to chime in.
Well, the turnaway study is recently released research that followed 1,000 women, half of whom made it just under the date cutoff to terminate an unplanned and unwanted pregnancy.
Okay.
And the other 500 were forced to carry that pregnancy to term. And the impact that it had on their educational goals and career goals and whatever, which certainly led me to wonder how that particular dividing line among women has a ripple effect out onto the gender pay gap and gender wealth gap, and how the more restrictive those options become, is that a big enough factor to impact the larger picture?
Absolutely. I think both of those questions side by side were fantastic. Like, yay, they blend together. To kind of answer the first one a little bit, I'm really grateful that Anna, like, you had more recent findings, because the groups that I'm in were more theorizing about the future, and the potential baby boom that will happen. It was theorized a year ago that, like, okay, between 2020 and 2021, we're gonna have a baby boom because everyone's stuck at home in the pandemic. And a lot of us in reproductive rights circles were like, actually, I think it's gonna be a year after that. I think it's going to be once we start opening up after the pandemic a little bit more. But all of this, pure theory, just having conversation. But when it comes to how a woman's right to manage her reproductive life, as you really aptly put it, and the gender pay gap and impact on wealth overall, it is absolutely directly correlating. I mean, even the countries, Anna, that you just highlighted, other than the United States, the access to reproductive health care and to abortion care changes between those countries. I mean, we're looking at Italy, where it's really difficult to access an abortion and it is highly stigmatized, versus other countries where they could still access it during the pandemic. I mean, we see the variety state to state in the United States, and how they could access, how people could access abortion care this past year, and looking forward. So it absolutely directly impacts a woman and a person who could get pregnant, their future, and both their pay and wealth that accumulates from it. And I was really excited to see that study having the two different subgroups that were compared. And I think that it's really important to highlight in conversations like this, because you have one half of people who, for the most part, a lot of women still struggle to access abortion in the United States and afford it. So that right there is a potential debt that they have to pay off and impacts their finances. And then people who are forced to carry to term and either keep the child or at least experience pregnancy, which we know is expensive in the United States. These are all facets of life that directly impacts your income and your wealth. So it's very serious repercussions.
Thank you. Are there any corporations that are doing it right? Because we look at these numbers, but are there some best practices that we can highlight? Are there companies that are implementing best practices that might help curb this issue our way? Loaded.
I'm not gonna give gold stars to any corporations. I honestly just can't think of any, but I can tell you that a very impactful direct action that a company, both corporation, nonprofit, anything that they can take, is to not only completely do away with relying on salary history, or salary requirements. Asking for that in the hiring process is very harmful to women and perpetuates the gender pay gap. So not only doing that, but posting your salary band. Like, if you have a job description, include what the salary range is. And that can really help with just the transparency that is required to really combat the gender pay gap.
Yeah, I'll second that. I'll just say, as I said at the end of my presentation, and Robin said during hers, we need the data. Like, companies need the data. I was talking to my husband, who's in finance for a company, and we were talking about the gender wealth gap, or the gender wage gap rather, and he was saying that, oh yeah, if you control for all these things and you're like, he thinks his company probably does well and paying women and men equally for equal work. And I'm like, well, you'd probably be the best person to answer that. Like you like have everyone's payroll data. Like that's what you do. Like, why don't you look at that? He's like, oh, I don't have time to do that. I'm like, come on, man. So I think the point is that, companies that ask these questions and actually look, they're doing better because, in this day and age, a lot of people want that equal pay for equal work. That doesn't get rid of all of the issues, right, as we talked about before, but it's a step forward in ensuring that there's equality at least there. But a lot of people can assume, people in C-suite, CEOs, et cetera, that their company's doing well, but they don't have the numbers to back that. They have the numbers, but they haven't looked at them or haven't asked to see them. And I think that's incredibly important if we don't know. And on the other side, for employees, if they don't feel comfortable talking about it to coworkers who, are in a similar position, then how are they going to know? How are they going to be able to advocate for themselves? So yeah, I think it just comes down to data as a first step at the very least.
Thank you. And I saw that Nancy just put in, a lot of us are familiar with the Women's Foundation here in St. Louis, and they do their scorecard for companies. And I think in the next couple of weeks, their new one is going to be shared with the public. For those of us who are still on the call, and I know that we still have like 35 of us, does anyone else have a question that they would like to ask instead of having to write it out? I'm using my educator, the pregnant pause.
Karen,
Yes.
has anyone ever done a research on men and how they really survey on how they really feel? Because I'm not sure they really are interested that much in equal pay for women because they're happy with what they're getting.
Everybody's nodding.
That's a great question. So my background's actually in psychology. So I'm like, oh, I wonder, I want to go do a study on that now. One thing I will say is that gender norms are really baked into our psyches, especially for, my generation and older. I think younger generations, I presented similar work to high schoolers, and one of the guys asked a question that was really about gender equity, and the way he phrased it just made me think, wow, like this is a totally different generation. Like it made me very hopeful for the future. But I think currently the adults in society, especially, like there's a lot of gender norms baked into that, and it's reflected in the fact that there's sometimes some discomfort when women in a couple, whether that's marriage or partnership, make more than the man. Like there can be internal struggles depending on different cultures within that couple that people need to talk about. And that still perpetuates to this day. Like it should be your success is my success, our finances are shared, but that's not always the case. So I say that to say that I think currently there probably is some truth to that. But I think like I said before, I am hopeful that the next generation is being more open-minded and more equality-minded.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I absolutely think that conversations like this within this group, and then what you can then carry to your friends and family, is really critical. Because like we've intimated a few times, you can talk with someone and tell them like, oh, did you know that the gender pay gap is still a thing? And for the most part, a lot of well-intentioned and good-hearted men would be like, no, like actually it is. So I think that there's a lot of just ignorance around it within like all genders. But since you asked about men in particular, I think that that's really important to have that conversation. And to your point of men being disinterested in changing the status quo for selfish reasons, it's not just men. There are white women who don't want to change the status quo for the same reason, and a lot of other people who are already in power. I think that a lot of this is how we either, for women, like internalize this misogyny and these gender norms and accept it as this is the way the world should be. Or the folks who benefit from it being in positions of power. But it really takes talking about it. I mean, with your right to speak to colleagues about your pay, from something as simple as that, all the way to being able to organize and create these improvements. A lot of this work is really important, and a lot of our generations are just uncomfortable. So it's really just kind of being that assertive person that's like, no, we're going to speak about this head on. No, it's uncomfortable the first few times, but you'll get used to it, and then it'll be fun, and you can have a conversation on Zoom at night with people.
So having those difficult conversations.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the time, and I know we usually try to finish our meetings before 8:30. I'm looking at the comments. Robin, Anna, thank you. You have just been wonderful. The information that is so valuable. Can we have copies of your slides, or can you give those to Laura that we can use those as we increase our knowledge level as we talk to people? And then one more question. One of my favorite quotes with Ruth Ginsburg is about that women belong, in all places where decisions are being made. So are we hopeful as more women run for office and are elected to office that we might start seeing a shift to help protect women and these issues that we've talked about? I know that's a loaded question.
Representation is great, right? Like I'm not going to say that it's not great. And yeah, if we have high level people, I mean, Kamala Harris had an op-ed, I think in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, where she was talking about how critical this is, that we can't let this moment pass us in terms of its impact on women. So, we have the second most powerful person in our government talking about that. I don't see how that can be harmful. Again, speaking for myself and not the Fed.
I'm looking at the time. I speak for all of us on this call. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, being so open and honest. It's such an important topic, and you've really given us some phrases and some more ammunition as we talk about these issues, about the myths that continue to haunt us. Because I know I reflect back when I had my daughter in 1978, I did not know a single professional woman who was married and had a child. And now we know the workforce and our younger women, what they are doing. They're changing the landscape. So just thank you. I speak for all of us. I've learned a lot. I know everyone on this call has learned a lot. And Susan Glassman or Ruth, do you want to say anything before we end this conversation for tonight?
I just want to echo Karen's thanks and appreciation to two excellent presenters. I personally learned a lot, things that I sort of knew a bit about from all the reading I do, but the framework and the data really helped my understanding and my anger about a lot of this. So thank you very much. Before we go, though, I do really want to encourage everybody on this call to make plans to join us on April 22nd for our Visionary Voices program with Reginald Dwayne Betts. It's something that you shouldn't miss. So please put that in your calendar and sign up for it. And having said that, thank you, everyone. Have a very good night, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody. And stay
Bye.
safe. You were wonderful. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And feel free to reach out to us.
Don't worry. We've got your name. We've got your number.
Sounds good.
Thank you
Good
so
night,
much.
everyone.
And thank you to all of my friends from Women's Voices and AUW that were on this call. Thank you. Have a good evening, and please stay safe, and hope everyone can get their vaccines.
Bye.
Then we can meet in person. Thanks, everybody. Be safe.